Today, we are looking at disability sociologically. My goal is to give you context for interpreting the main arguments in the Wendell E. reading, The Social Construction of Disability. Disability scholars contrast the medical and social models of disability, with the medical model being dominant until recent decades. This model tends to position disability as a deficit, an impairment or sickness needing to be corrected or fixed. An underlying assumption here is that people with disabilities should strive to fit into more normative models of mental and physical health, and that disability research should help with this process. The unit of analysis in the medical model tends to be the people with disabilities. For instance, if a person using a wheelchair is unable to access a building with stairs, the wheelchair would be seen as the barrier, not the stairs. The medical model rests on the power to define what is normal and abnormal by classifying, diagnosing, prescribing, and treating particular conditions. We can see connections here between the medical model and the medicalization of disability. In contrast, the social model of disability grew out of disability activism and scholarship emerging in the 1970s and 1980s. Instead of focusing on disability as a deficit requiring medical rehabilitation, this social model looks at how social, economic, and political factors are involved in defining what counts as disability, shaping how we interpret and respond to disability, and even increasing or decreasing rates of disability. Dr. Rosemary Garland Thompson, English professor and co-director of the Emory Disability Studies Initiative, argues that the social model reconceptualizes disability as, quote, a cultural interpretation of human variation rather than an inherent inferiority, a pathology to cure, or an undesirable trait to eliminate, unquote. Scholars aligned with the social model seek to destigmatize disease, illness, and forms of impairment, while still acknowledging contexts in which medical intervention can be useful. Susan Wendell, in her 1996 book, The Rejected Body, contributes to the social model of disability by asking readers to consider how social and biological factors interact in creating disability. Let's look at 3 of her arguments. Wendell points out how standards of normality include certain groups while excluding others. We can imagine how basic architecture and design is modeled around certain bodies, needs, even experiences. For instance, think about this office door. How high and wide is the door frame? How high is the door knob? What shape is the doorknob? How heavy is the door? Is there a ledge at the base of the door? Expectations are embedded in the social environment. These expectations enable and constrain how we navigate that environment. In many ways, the society we've built determines who is considered able-bodied and who is not, as well as who is considered mentally ill and who is not. Wendell also demonstrates how disability is constructed by the failure to give people with disabilities the amount and kind of help they need to participate fully in all major aspects of life. Think about all the different forms of support that most industrialized societies already give to non-disabled people. Public funds are spent to subsidize education, provide emergency services, create affordable local recreation. Even public transportation is heavily subsidized, but relying on the bus stop by your house to get to work or school isn't seen as a form of dependence. This help that non-disabled people receive tends to be taken for granted and not considered help at all. Only when someone requires a different kind of help or a different amount of help are they seen as socially dependent and in need of accommodation. Thus, Wendell argues, disability is socially constructed through the failure or unwillingness to create ability among people who do not fit the physical and mental profile of paradigm citizens. So far, we've looked at Wendell's arguments about what counts as disability and how people with disabilities may not be given the support they need for full societal integration. A third key argument from Wendell looks at how rates of disability can increase due to social conditions. She notes that many avoidable circumstances and events cause sickness and injury that can lead to disability. The violence of invasions and civil wars cause direct injuries and the spread of disease. They also cause chaos and deprive people of basic needs. Inequitable distribution of vital resources such as water, food, clothing, and shelter lead to much disabling physical damage, either directly from malnutrition or indirectly from disease. Other conditions like high-risk work environments, the increasing pace of work, child labor and child abuse, low public safety standards, lacking healthcare systems, and poverty can all increase the likelihood of disability. Environmental degradation is also a crucial factor. Consider the long-term impact of living in an area with high levels of pollution. In many countries, people who are poor, racialized, and marginalized in other ways are more likely to live near hazardous waste sites and polluting industries. This is environmental racism. In the United States, for example, people of color are 2 times more likely to live without clean water. A well-known example of environmental racism in Canada is Nova Scotia's Africville. Canadian history textbooks often emphasize how, from 1840 to 1860, Nova Scotia was the last stop on the Underground Railroad, through which African Americans escaped from enslavement. Less commonly discussed is how the city of Halifax treated residents in the poor Black neighborhood known as Africville. This was a community where hundreds of descendants of African slaves resided. The municipal government never provided this neighborhood with water, electricity, or other basic services. The Halifax government wanted to redevelop the land Africville was on, so they sought to kick out the residents. Despite protests, the city introduced hazards that made living in Africville dangerous. In the area surrounding the neighborhood, the city built a slaughterhouse, a toxic waste dump, and a hospital for World War II soldiers with contagious viruses. Eventually, the city bulldozed the neighborhood entirely, so they could push out residents in 1964. By emphasizing the social causes of sickness, injury, and disability, Wendell ultimately highlights the intersections of social organization and biology. And when we put her three arguments together, we get a fuller picture of the social construction of disability. Wendell also suggests we can work toward the social deconstruction of disability. She writes, "A great deal of disability can be prevented with good public health, safety standards, and practices, but also by relatively minor changes in the built environment that provide accessibility to people with a wide range of physical characteristics and abilities." To practice applying Wendell's arguments and to begin thinking about the social deconstruction of disability, check out this TED Talk and reflection questions.